The night the highway swallowed everything in black water and headlights, Harrison Cole almost didn't stop. He saw the old woman first, a shape at the edge of the shoulder, one arm raised, the other clutching something to her chest. His wipers were going full speed and still losing. The rain was the kind that made you feel like the sky had given up on restraint entirely. He was already 40 minutes late for the most important board call of his quarter. His phone was buzzing on the passenger seat. His assistant had texted 3 times. He passed her. Then, about 200 meters down the 401, something made him ease off the gas. He couldn't explain it then, and he still can't now. He told himself it was because the shoulder was too narrow, she was too close to traffic. He told himself a lot of things in those seconds. He pulled over anyway. Harrison Cole, CEO of Meridian Group, 41 years old, a man who had built his career on not being distracted by things that weren't his problem, put the hazards on and reversed in the rain. She was older than he'd thought. 70, maybe more. White hair plastered flat against her head. The thing she was clutching turned out to be a canvas grocery bag, soaked through, with a carton of eggs miraculously still on top. She had no umbrella, no jacket over her cardigan. She was wearing slip-on shoes that looked like they belonged inside a house. He rolled down the passenger window. "Can I take you somewhere?" "You shouldn't be out here." She peered at him the way people do when they're deciding whether to trust a stranger in the dark. Then she said, "My car broke down back there. About a kilometer. Where are you headed?" "Brampton, Castlemore Road." That was 20 minutes in the opposite direction from where Harrison needed to be. He looked at his phone, 4 missed calls now. He looked at the woman standing in the rain with her eggs. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you home." Her name was Harriet Beausoleil, and she said it the French way, Beausoleil, and corrected him gently when he mangled it. She was 73. She'd been driving back from her daughter's place in Mississauga, and her Honda had just died on her. Alternator, she suspected. Same thing that had happened to her late husband's truck years ago. She said this without self-pity, the way people who have survived a great deal talk about inconvenience, matter-of-factly, almost cheerfully. Harrison drove and half listened to his buzzing phone and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely ashamed of something small. The smallness of it was what got him. He had almost driven past a 73-year-old woman standing in a highway rainstorm because he had a board call. "You work late," Harriet said, nodding at his phone. "Always." "My son was like that." She said it with a smile, but there was something underneath the smile that Harrison noticed and filed away. Was. Past tense. He didn't ask. He dropped her at a bungalow on Castlemore Road with a front porch light on and a garden, even in October, that clearly mattered to someone. She thanked him 3 times and offered him the eggs. He declined. She gave him a look that suggested she thought he was foolish for it. He was an hour late to the call. His CFO, a meticulous man named Douglas Park, no relation, he'd clarify every time someone assumed, had already run the first 20 minutes without him. The board wasn't happy. Harrison took the heat. He didn't explain why he was late, because explaining felt like asking for credit he hadn't earned. He didn't think much about Harriet Beausoleil after that. Life moved fast, and he let it. 3 weeks later, he was in the lobby of his own building, the Meridian Tower on Bay Street, 42 floors of glass and intention, when he recognized her. She was standing at the reception desk with a small paper bag, talking to his front desk manager, a young woman named Priscilla, who had the patient expression of someone being very polite with a visitor who hadn't made an appointment. "Miss Beausoleil?" Harrison said. Harriet turned. Her face broke into a recognition that was also something else, relief maybe. "There he is," she said. "I told her I knew you." He walked over. Priscilla gave him a look he decoded as I was about to call security. "It's fine," he said. "She's a friend." The word surprised him as he said it. Harriet had brought butter tarts, real ones, from a bakery in Brampton she'd been going to for 30 years, she said, run by a family named Okonkwo who had been her neighbors once and had never forgotten her. She thrust the bag at him like it was a transaction to be concluded. "You wouldn't take the eggs," she said. "So." He laughed. He couldn't remember the last time someone had made him laugh in that lobby. He walked her to the elevator and she looked around the building the way his daughter Mila used to look at aquariums. Like, everything deserved careful attention. He showed her his office. She looked out the window at the city and said, "You can see so far from here. Do you ever get used to it?" "A long time ago," he said. She tutted, "That's a shame." Before she left, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd take the bus home. The car was still not fixed. The quote from the mechanic was, apparently, $400 she didn't exactly have sitting around this month. Harrison wrote a check before she reached the elevator. She didn't take it. She held it back out to him, politely but without hesitation, the way people who have real dignity handle things. "That's not why I came," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm offering." She looked at him for a moment. "You're a strange man for someone with an office this big," she said, and left. He called a mechanic he knew in the West End, and had the car sorted out anyway, anonymously, told them to bill it to his personal account and not to mention his name. He half expected her to call and be angry about it. She never called. He thought about that. He thought about it more than he expected to. November came in hard that year. Harrison was deep in a merger that had started to feel like a hostage situation. 3 months of due diligence, a counterparty that kept shifting its terms, and a board that was losing confidence in his instincts. He was sleeping 4 hours a night. He was eating at his desk. His executive assistant, a composed woman named Sandra Young, who had worked with him for 6 years, started leaving protein bars near his keyboard without comment. His daughter Mila called on a Thursday, and he let it go to voicemail. He told himself he'd call back. He didn't. He was coming out of a late dinner on King Street, a dinner that had achieved nothing except a larger bar bill than he'd intended, when his phone showed a number he didn't recognize. He answered out of habit. It was a man's voice, steady, measured, but with something underneath it that Harrison recognized as the specific effort of someone holding themselves together. "Mr. Cole? My name is Theo Biosoleo, Harriet's son. I'm sorry to call you. She had your card. She's in emergency at Trillium Health. She fell this afternoon. Her hip." Harrison stood on King Street in the cold with his car 20 feet away and said, "Which entrance?" He didn't know why he went. He knew he went. Theo Biosoleo was sitting in a waiting area chair with his coat still on, a man somewhere in his mid-40s, with his mother's same precise way of holding himself upright even when circumstances made it hard. He stood when Harrison came in, and there was a moment of awkwardness. They were strangers to each other in a room full of strangers. "You didn't have to come," Theo said. "How is she?" "Surgery in the morning. Hip replacement. She's asking if she can keep the old one, the hip, as a souvenir." He said it in a way that made it clear it was exactly the kind of thing Harriet would ask, and they both ended up doing that thing where you half-law at something that isn't funny because the alternative is worse. Harrison sat with him. He didn't have a reason to be there except that he was, so he stayed. They talked the way men do in waiting rooms, around things, mostly about safe subjects first. Theo worked in urban planning for the city. He'd been living in Vancouver until 2 years ago and had come back when his father died, to be closer to his mother. He said it simply, without any performance of sacrifice. "She talks about you," Theo said at one point. The man who stopped on the highway. Harrison didn't know what to do with that. "She brought me butter tarts," he said. "She brings butter tarts to everyone she thinks has forgotten that people are decent." Theo looked at his hands. "She's been doing it my whole life. The mailman, the woman at the pharmacy, my grade 2 teacher for some reason every Christmas until the teacher retired." The image settled in Harrison somewhere it didn't leave. He went home at midnight. Harriet came through surgery fine, which he found out because Theo texted him, a fact that surprised him, that they had moved into the territory of being people who texted each other. He visited her in the hospital. Twice. The first time she lectured him about iron deficiency because he looked pale and she had opinions. The second time she was sitting up, doing a crossword, and she introduced him to 2 nurses and her physiotherapist, as though he were a neighbor she'd had for years. He brought her flowers the second time, white tulips because the gift shop was out of everything else, and she put them on her tray table and looked at them very seriously and said, "My husband used to bring me these, not for occasions, just because." "What was he like?" Harrison asked. "Loud," she said immediately, "and wrong about almost everything and completely unable to admit it, and the kindest man I ever met. I miss him every day." She said this the way she said most things, directly, without apology. "Do you have someone?" "Not anymore," Harrison said. "Divorced. 4 years. Children? A daughter. Mila. She's 19. And you talk to her?" He paused a moment too long. "Harrison," Harriet said, not unkindly, but with the particular authority of someone who has watched enough life to know when someone is losing something they don't realize is leaving. "Call your daughter. It's complicated. Everything's complicated. Call anyway." He changed the subject. She let him. But it stayed, The merger closed in December, barely, and with terms that Harrison considered a draw at best. The board congratulated him with the specific warmth of people who had expected failure and were now recalibrating. He went home to his condo on the waterfront, a place that was beautiful and efficient, and that had never quite managed to feel lived in, and poured himself a drink and stood at the window and thought about what Harriet had said. He called Mila. It was 11 at night. She answered on the second ring, and her voice had that wary, careful quality she'd developed in the last 2 years, the voice she used when she didn't know which version of him she was about to get. "Hey, Dad. Hey, kid. I know it's late. I wanted to hear your voice." A pause. Not a hostile pause. Surprised, maybe. "I'm okay," she said. "I've been okay, you?" "Tired," he said honestly. "Working too much." "You know." "Yeah," she said it quietly. "I know." They talked for 23 minutes. He knew because afterward he looked at the call log, the way you look at evidence of something you want to make sure was real. She was doing well in her second year at McMaster. She had a roommate who drove her crazy and a professor she loved, and a part-time job at a cafe she described, with an affection that made him realize she was building her own life the way people do when their parents aren't watching. She was building it without him because he hadn't been there to be part of it, and he had done that. He did not say any of that. He listened, and that, he thought afterward, was probably the most useful thing he'd done in months. Christmas came and went. He spent it in Toronto. Mila went to her mother's in Ottawa, which was the arrangement, which was fine, which he told himself was fine until he was alone on Christmas afternoon, with a grocery store rotisserie chicken and the specific silence of a condo that no one had decorated. He had coffee with Harriet in January. She was on a cane now, moving carefully, the physio having reclaimed most of her confidence, but not all of it yet. They met at a cafe on Queen Street she'd been going to since the 90s, where the owner recognized her and brought her usual without being asked. Theo was there. Harrison hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure if it had been arranged. He suspected, from the way Harriet studied the menu with theatrical interest upon his arrival, that it had. Theo was easier to talk to than he remembered from the hospital. Less compressed, maybe. More present. He had his mother's quality of listening like what you said actually mattered. Not performing interest, just genuinely having it. He talked about a housing project he was working on in Scarborough, affordable units on city land, the kind of project that took 3 years to get to a vote, and then another 2 to build, and that most people in the city never knew existed. He talked about it with the quiet conviction of someone who had decided years ago that unglamorous, useful work was the only kind worth doing. Harrison talked about the merger, and then stopped because he heard himself talking about it and it sounded like a very polished version of something that didn't, ultimately, matter that much. "What do you actually want to be doing?" Theo asked, not antagonistically. Just the question. Harrison didn't have an answer. That itself was an answer. Harriet ate her scone and said nothing, which meant she was listening very carefully. February. Harrison did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He left work at 5 o'clock on a Friday. He didn't know what to do with himself for the first 3 hours. He ordered food he didn't finish. He watched half a documentary about the Franklin expedition. He reorganized his bookshelf, which took longer than expected, because he kept stopping to look at books he'd bought and never read. He texted Mila a photo of a copy of a novel she'd recommended 2 years ago that he'd never opened. She texted back, "Oh my God, you actually have it," he texted. Starting tonight, she sent back a string of emojis he had to look up. It was the most alive he'd felt all week. He saw Theo again in March, genuinely by accident this time, at a fundraiser for an affordable housing organization that Harrison's company had been quietly funding for years. Theo was there representing the city. They recognized each other across a crowded room and moved toward each other with the relief of knowing someone real in a room full of performance. They got a beer afterward. And then another. Theo talked about his father, about growing up with a man who fixed everything that broke, who built a deck in a summer weekend, who knew every neighbor on their street by name and first name and sometimes life story, who had died of a heart attack at 68 and left behind a garden that Harriet still tended like a promise. "He would have liked you," Theo said. He liked people who helped without making it a thing. Harrison looked at his glass. He thought about the highway in October, the rain, the 4 missed calls on his phone. He thought about how close he'd come to not stopping. "I almost didn't stop," he said. "That night, your mother on the highway, I almost kept driving." Theo nodded slowly. "She knows that." "She does?" She says that's why she brought you the butter tarts. Because you stopped anyway. Harrison sat with that for a moment. The idea that a 73-year-old woman in a soaked cardigan had read him that accurately in the middle of a rainstorm in seconds, had understood something about him that he'd barely understood about himself. She's a remarkable person, he said. She is, Theo agreed. She keeps collecting people, her whole life. The mailman, my grade 2 teacher. He paused. You. It was the first time Harrison understood that this was a gift being offered. Not just the coffee and the dinners and the strange expanding friendship. The being collected, the being seen as someone worth keeping. April. Mila came to Toronto for a weekend, ostensibly to see a friend, but she texted and asked if she could stay at his place. And he said yes in a way that he hoped didn't sound as relieved as he was. She arrived Friday evening with a backpack and an easy confidence he didn't remember her having. She looked at his condo, which he had, in the preceding 2 weeks, acquired a plant for and some actual artwork for the bare wall in the living room, and said, "It's better in here than last time." "I'm working on it," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh. It reminded him of when she was 12, and everything funny made her laugh with her whole body, and she hadn't learned yet to be careful about it. He made dinner. Pasta, which he was actually capable of, unlike most things in his kitchen. They ate at the table instead of in front of the television, which was something he'd started doing for no particular reason, and which now felt normal. She talked about school. He listened. She talked about a boy she was cautiously interested in, and he said nothing except that sounds like a good sign. And she gave him a look like she was recalibrating her expectations of him, which was fair. On Saturday morning, she asked how he knew Harriet Beausoleil. He'd mentioned her, apparently more than he'd realized, and Mila had been paying attention in that quiet way of hers. He told her the story, the highway, the rain, the butter tarts, the hospital at midnight, the coffee in January, and Theo. He told it plainly without making himself the hero of it, because he wasn't. Mila listened with her hands around her coffee cup. At the end she said, "She sounds like she has you figured out." "I think she does," he said. "Good," Mila said. "Somebody should." He didn't trust himself to respond to that, so he got up and poured himself more coffee. But he was smiling when he turned back around, and she saw it, and she smiled too, and that was enough. He asked Theo in May if this was strange, the three of them, the orbit they'd settled into without anyone officially deciding to. Coffee with Harriet. Occasional dinners with Theo. The texts that had started to assume continuity, references to things they'd talked about before, the shorthand of people who knew each other. "Strange how?" Theo asked. "I gave your mother a ride in October. 4 months later I'm having dinner with you twice a month, and she's texting me to ask if I've called my daughter." Theo considered this seriously. "My mother has been collecting people since before I was born," he said. "She collected my father. He was a stranger she helped jumpstart a car in 1974, and somehow that became 44 years. She doesn't really let logic interfere with who she decides matters. That doesn't run in the family," Harrison asked. Theo looked at him with something careful in his expression, something that had been there for a while that Harrison had been deliberately not reading too directly. "Maybe it does," Theo said. "Eventually." Harrison nodded. His heart was doing something inconvenient. "I'm trying not to read into things," he said. "You're not particularly good at that," Theo said. "For a CEO," Harrison laughed. "No, I'm really not." They were in Theo's neighborhood by then. A street in the East End where the houses were close together, and the trees were old, and everyone seemed to have a dog. And they had been walking for 20 minutes after dinner without planning to, just walking because neither of them had suggested stopping. "I'm 41 years old," Harrison said, "and I have only recently started to understand what I was doing with myself all this time." "What were you doing building things?" "Acquiring things. Optimizing." He paused. "Driving past people on highways." Theo stopped walking. He turned to face Harrison with the directness he'd inherited entirely from his mother. "And now?" he said. Harrison looked at him. "At this man who came back from across the country when his father died, who builds housing for people who can't afford it, who sits in hospital waiting rooms and texts near strangers updates at midnight, who listens like it costs him nothing because it costs him nothing." He thought about October and rain and hazard lights and how close the whole thing had come to not happening at all. "Now," Harrison said, "I'm trying to be the kind of person who stops." Theo held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "You're already that person. You were that person in October. You just needed someone to point it out." He stepped slightly closer in the way that is a question, and Harrison answered it. Mila met Harriet in June, at the garden behind the house on Castlemore Road. Harriet had been on her feet for months by then, and the garden looked like a project of great love and stubborn determination. The tomatoes were staked, and the dahlias were coming up, and there were 3 different kinds of herbs in the raised bed that Theo had built in April, quietly, over a weekend while his mother was visiting a friend. Mila crouched down next to one of the planters and asked what kind of basil it was, and Harriet looked at her with the same expression she'd turned on Harrison in that lobby months ago, assessing, direct, concluding something quickly, and then said, "Genovese. You garden?" "I'm trying," Mila said. "My apartment only has a south-facing window, and I keep killing things." "Come back in August," Harriet said. "I'll show you how to take cuttings." She did not include this as an invitation or a suggestion. It was simply a thing that would happen. Mila looked at Harrison with an expression that said, "I see what you mean," and Harrison thought, not for the first time that summer, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Theo came out from the kitchen with lemonade and 4 glasses, and Harriet said, without looking up from the tomatoes, "Your father would have liked today." No one said anything. The garden held them in its particular June light. Then Mila, who had not met Harriet before this afternoon, and who did not know what had been said and not said in hospital rooms and on winter streets and in 20-minute phone calls that rebuilt something fractured. Mila handed her empty glass to Harrison without thinking, the way she used to when she was small, and said to Harriet, "Tell me about him." And Harriet Beausoleil set down her watering can and sat in the garden chair and began to talk about her husband, the loud, wrong, completely unkind about being wrong, kindest man she'd ever known. And none of them went anywhere for a long time. Harrison sat with Theo on the back step and watched his daughter lean toward this woman she'd known for 2 hours, and listened to the sound of a garden in June, and he thought, I almost drove past her, I almost missed all of this. He didn't miss it. That was everything.